So the first question, we've had a lot of talk about Wagner women. Wagner women, of course, is an enormously interesting subject. One, I think, rather almost surprisingly enlightened and revealing treatment of that subject, especially in terms of feminism in the United States, is in Joe Horowitz's book, Wagner Nights, the last section of that book. I don't necessarily, well, it's a very interesting book. Mostly it's just sort of a record of Wagner life in New York City in particular, in the 1880s and 1890s under Anton Seidel. But the third chapter, third part, is about how American feminism was shaped by and reflected in Wagner, especially certain very key figures like Willa Cather. It's very interesting if you haven't read it. Anyway, my first question is on this subject very specifically. So here's the idea. These are various themes which appear in the early operas, the first three, but let's count Flying Dutchman too as an early opera. And then let's see if we can find other examples and how they compare and contrast with the use in the early operas of each of these themes. So number one is women sold or coerced into marriage. Anybody want to start? Yes.
Freya.
Right, Freya, that's right. Very good. Sieglinde has been sold into marriage. Now, just taking those two for starters, what can we say about the attitude that Wagner shows, or that we feel about both of them? How does Freya feel about her being sold into marriage to the giants? She doesn't want it. And what is the general tone of the action, the general feeling of people around her? And I think in this case, rather clearly, Wagner's own feeling about this action to offer Freya in exchange for building Valhalla. Yeah, outrage. It's considered to be the absolute height of moral, human, social, and not only moral. What happens when Freya's taken away? They all start to die, or they all start to age. In other words, it's not just moral outrage, but it's real, undermines the whole webs that holds human society together and makes it vibrant and alive. What about Sieglinde? Now, Sieglinde is much less sort of cosmic than Freya. But what's very clear we feel about Sieglinde's being sold into marriage? Yeah, she's certainly made victimized. Do you remember what how Sieglinde reacts after her union with Siegmund? What kind of state is she in when we see her in Act 2? Does anyone here remember? How is Sieglinde in Act 2? After she and Siegmund has put their wedding, they came on the wedding night exactly together.
She feels guilty.
She feels horrible. She's absolutely not guilty. Why does she feel guilty?
I guess because she broke the wedding vows, but also because she thinks
everything. That's not only wrong. It's exactly wrong, and it shows exactly that Wagner is not at least at this point at all on the side of the idea. She's very guilty. Yes, you say.
She feels that the only pure relationship she has had has been with Siegmund, and that therefore she has betrayed it before.
Yes, she's damaged goods. Exactly. She's damaged goods because she's been married to a man she didn't love.
That's the same.
Okay, right, I believe it. We all set this up so Simon could. Okay, any more? Lots more examples of this. Yeah?
Isolde.
Isolde, very good. Isolde is being sold into marriage as part of a political marriage. And so what is the general attitude towards that? How does she feel about it?
Outrage.
Awful. And how does Tristan feel about it? Awful. And this one is not as clear, perhaps, how sort of Wagner thinks like that. But it's clearly not something that it's not we don't have a good feeling about it. And it doesn't end up well either. It's not. Any more? There's lots of absolutely. Wotan is basically, it doesn't have to be so. I said sold or coerced into marriage. He ties her up on the rock for the first man that finds her. Now,
and it gets done to her again in December.
Right. Now, it's true that in the Brunhilde case, there is a little bit of a mitigation. Wotan initially, when he says what he's going to do with the other Valkyrie present, says, I'm just going to put you to sleep on the rock, and the first man that finds you, and he paints a very grim picture of marriage, you'll sit on the hearth and spin. common woman at the beck and call of her husband. An extremely classical Biedermeier view of marriage, actually, which Wagner obviously is holding in great contempt. It's like, and remember how the reaction of the other Valkyries are there. They're aghast. Actually, that is what provokes their most violent response to Wotan, is when he says this is what he's going to do. And she faints. I mean, it's terrible. Then he mitigates it by putting the fire, which is a big mitigation, because she's still going to be sold into marriage, as it were, coerced into marriage, but it's going to be at least, well, also, it's not clear to her that it's marriage, but she's going to be found only by Siegfried. Nevertheless, it's clear, that's another case which is clear that this is, Wagner is looking at this as a very bad thing. Anymore, there's plenty more. Excuse me? Yeah, that's exactly what this is all about. Yeah. Senta. That's right.
I mean, the song, right?
Oh, absolutely. Both women. Very good. Okay, I'm sorry. I did give you full on the script. Give them again, please, sir. There's two women that are getting these prizes. Which Elizabeth and Ava. Yeah, both Ava and Elizabeth are being offered as prizes to whoever wins a song competition. One of the things that Tannhäuser and Meistersinger have in common, although in Tannhäuser it's not played up nearly to the extent it is in Meistersinger, is that in both cases women have been offered as prizes. One thing you guys are noticing, I suppose, is that we've touched practically every single Wagner. This is an obsession of Wagner's. Now, there is a significant difference to both Ava and Elizabeth, which is perhaps worth noting, especially in the case of Elizabeth. Can anybody tell me what that is?
They're willing.
They want it.
But not in all cases. Obviously, what would have happened if Beckmesser had won the competition?
Another Senta or
another Sieglinde or something.
Yeah, right.
Right. Whereas, yes.
This is as much a question as if Wotan paid with his eye to get Fricka, was she sold then? Does that mean?
No, that's actually different.
Okay.
Wotan staked as a wedding dower that he would be a good husband, the only eye he had left. So he didn't pay for her. That was like a I don't know how a stake of good faith.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different. That's a good question, but it's more like a security payment. But I don't think that we can think of that one in that light. It's true that Elizabeth, one wonders if anyone other than Tannhäuser, of course it doesn't come out, but if the song competition go along as it's going to go along. But there is one difference, both with Elizabeth and Ava, which is worth noticing, is that neither Elizabeth nor Ava certainly shows horror at the idea of marrying Beckmesser. It makes it very clear that she won't. And I think we see that she has enough ascendancy over Wagner that he would never, ever be able to get her to do it. I mean, it's quite clear that this is all just, of course, conjecture. But both the world of the Wagner book and the world of Ava and the 16th century Nuremberg are as close as Wagner ever gets to sort of historical societies. And so in these historical societies, it's quite clear that women at least accept the concept that this is something that people do. Which doesn't mean in either case that Wagner approves, but it's less explicit. And neither the Landgraf and Wagner are seldom portrayed as being really negative or detestable people because they're selling their daughters into marriage to the person who sings this. But it could be done. And sometimes it's done with Wagner. I've never seen Wagner particularly. That aspect of Tannhäuser is not usually done. Any more? I think there are a couple more. Well, no. Elsa says, I'll give you everything I am for saving. So she actually offers it. So I think that's a little bit different. That's practically the only opera where we don't have that. Well, Parsifal. Parsifal, we don't really have that either. But pretty much everything else, pretty much all the other ones we do. Sieglinde, Brunhilde, yeah. Well, so what about some of the earlier operas? Yeah, Senta. In a way, Senta has been sold into marriage. Now here again, it's also different because, of course, he represents what she wants. But nevertheless, it does create a certain tension in the plot because Eric, who of course does not understand, cannot understand Senta, sees that she's just obeying her father, who's a greedy, is selling his daughter for money. herself for money, I would have to say that Dahlem is perhaps less obnoxious, less hateful, less criticizable. I mean, he seems, yes, he's often played as kind of ridiculous and very greedy, and in Nazi Germany he was played very extensively as the greedy Jew. There was even a production where it was clear that Zenta was a adopted Aryan pure girl who was in anyway, I do think that the idea of it is a little bit different in Flying Dutchman, which I think is significant. Okay, now what about the early operas? Anybody think of one we have in the early operas?
Rienzi's sister.
She's not really forced into marriage. Not in Rienzi, I don't think that's right. There is, however, an early opera where we do have it. Absolutely. And Das Liebes Verbot. He says to her, you know, if you will marry me, if you will sleep with me, I mean, then he's going to kill himself, but initially he'd say, marry me, I will rescind so there is a kind of coercion. I mean, it's not selling, but I didn't say sold or coerced into marriage. In other words, she's definitely a pawn. There's no question that she's being used as a pawn for Angelo's, what's her name? Is that Isabella?
Yeah.
Yeah, Isabella is being used very much as a pawn there. It's a little bit different, but I do think it's sort of the beginning. I think that we can, I think Wagner certainly feels very negatively about this. And one of the big patterns in my mind in Wagner's works is a very strong sympathy with women and women's place, and also a very strong sympathy, perhaps the very first, even before Ibsen, to have a very strong sense not only of sympathy for women and women's need for independence, but women's existence as sexual beings. The women in Wagner are clearly as sexually motivated as the men, sometimes perhaps even more so. That, however, is not true in Flying Dutchman. I mean, neither, I don't think sex, except for Eric, is an issue. I mean, Eric is the only one who seems to be in love in sort of the normal way. But Wagner, even right, I would say the first character of Wagner's, in which I think he really shows women as a complex sexual beings, is actually ironically the figure of Saint Elizabeth in Tannhäuser. It's one we might think of as being, you know, this chaste virgin, but she's clearly very much in love with and disturbed by the kind of nature of her love with Tannhäuser. And of course, Venus herself. And after all, Wagner rewrote, we've talked about this when we did Tannhäuser, but one of the main reasons Wagner was constantly obsessed with rewriting Tannhäuser was he was very eager to present Venus as not being just some kind of Herod called her. First version, he complained that she was too much like a Victorian heroine. In other words, just a hussy. And he interested in having a well-rounded figure. So I think that this theme does start right from the earliest. I mean, it comes a little bit in this regard. And it's and certainly in Flying Dutchman. And this is a major Wagnerian theme that he looks very, very much down on. I think he's very, very much against the use of women as sort of social and economic pawns. Okay, let's go to number 2. Intense sibling relationships. I bet you can think of one. Siegfried. I guess Siegmund and Sieglinde sort of is the ultimately intense sibling relationship. Yeah? Yeah, Fasold and Wagner is an intense sibling relationship. Yeah, that's right. So what about in the early operas? Yeah, Albrecht and Mima, they're not necessarily, they call each other brothers. It's not clear that they're actually brothers, but sure, I'll buy it still. What about the early operas? Here we have some good examples. Especially even of intense in that the dividing line between normal type sibling relationships as Fasold and Wagner. I've yet to see a ring where there are homosexual, homoerotic overtones in the relationship between Fasold and Wagner. Although I dare say I shall. So, but what about sibling relationships where there definitely are erotic moments? Siegmund and Sieglinde, of course, takes it to the ultimate extreme. But what about others? Some in the early operas. Then I think we have very much on.
Did somebody say Das Liebes Verbot that we were just talking about?
Yes, I think to some extent there, the relationship between Isabel and Claudio is very, very intense. And certainly the relationship, what I was mostly thinking was Rienzi. The relationship between Rienzi and Irina, after all, they end up having a kind of love death together at the end, and as brother and sister. They have a very intense and
Their love duet is actually the climax. Their duet is the climax of the action. And then Adriana comes on, it's a very small.
Right. It's very strange, very unsuccessful dramatically. But nevertheless, in the light of what Wagner is going to do later, I think that easily make a point that Wagner is quite obsessed with extremely intense and somewhat ambiguous sibling relationships. If you read Knudfel's biography, Wagner, The Last of the Titans, it's become sort of the general leitmotif of the book, that Wagner's obsessive, enormous love and probably incestuous love would be for his older sister, the actress, is a great shaping force in his works. I would buy it, but it could reflect itself in this particular theme itself. Any more?
Brunhilde and Siegfried?
Well, that could be seen, yes. He's not. I don't think he's aware of her. I mean, he may have no as a relation, but she might be a little more aware of him. Of course, you could also say Wotan and Fricka. Since in the mythology, they're brother and sister. But that's kind of not fair. Yeah.
Hagen in the Götterdämmerung.
Yes, he does have a very complex and interesting relationship with his half-brother and half-sister. And frankly, Gutu and Gutun themselves, Gutu and Gutun to me is sort of unexplored territory. They're usually done kind of in ciphers, largely because Götterdämmerung is so complex that I don't think stage directors have time to really get into their characters. And often they're not sung by singer-actors of the stature that can really bring these things to life. But actually, there's a lot of dynamic there is quite interesting between Gunther and Gutun, and certainly can be explored. Any more?
Well, the Rhine Maidens are siblings, and they're pretty
right. I don't know if and the Valkyries are over there, but now, certainly the relationship to the Valkyries between Waltraud and Matilda. I mean, for many of us, perhaps, certainly for Chereau, he even said so explicitly in New York a few months ago, the emotionally most intense scene in the entire ring is between the two sisters, Brunhilde and Waltraud in Act 1 of Götterdämmerung. It's certainly one of the greatest scenes in the ring, and there's an awfully intense relationship. He captures sort of the combination of the link of shared memories, the use of guilt because of shared memories, all these kinds of things which characterize sibling relationships. Anybody else? Or should we go to the next? Let's go to the next. Marriage between mortal and immortal or between beings of different realms. Well, this is a big one. Okay, who wants to start? Yeah.
Wotan and Erda. Well,
Wotan and Erda are both immortals, but yes,
But different.
there are different realms. That's certainly right. Alberich and what's her name? Grimhilde. No, not Grimhilde. Grimhilde. Yeah, that's right. The mother of the Givishers, who he bought specifically with money. Interesting. Another example. That's what we forgot. That was a woman who was sold into marriage. The mother of Hagen was sold into marriage, which also says something about what Wagner thinks about these kinds of relationships. Yes, that's right. Well, Zenta the Dutchman is an excellent example. Right. The Zenta the Dutchman clearly, explicitly, and I think very necessarily, belong to different realms. That's kind of the whole point, in a way. Venus and Tana, very good. That causes problems, too.
Even Lohengrin and Elsa.
Totally Lohengrin and Elsa. Absolutely. Lohengrin completely comes from a different realm. What can we say so far about the unions that we're seeing for most of these? If we like to look at Zenta and the Dutchman, Lohengrin. Well, Zenta and the Dutchman, they do get together, but it doesn't do them a lot of good in any practical sense, since they die immediately. Elsa and Lohengrin, of course, it fails. I mean, they get married, but they never consummate it because she asks the question. What about Wotan with the parents of Siegmund and Sieglinde? Wotan is Elsa. Do we ever know the name of their mother? Not in the rings. She's never mentioned. She's called Mama. I was home with the mother in Sieglinde's narration. Once again, there are lots of problems that grow out of it. Certainly. Yeah. Anybody else think of more?
Well, Walter and Eva come from very different.
That's absolutely true. They come from very different realms. That sometimes is brought out in some productions, and sometimes not.
Yeah, Freya is one of the gods, and one
it never quite makes it, but yeah. I'm assuming that the giants are honest guys, and I think that we're supposed to assume that. That's right. So what about in the early operas?
Defame.
Defame, absolutely. It's central to the plot of Defame. The whole idea of Defame is the concept that he's a mortal god and she's a mortal fairy. And how is that one resolved? That one resolved in a way totally different from many of these, as Simon pointed out, that he leaves the world and goes up. I mean, in other words, it's a sort of a classic fairy book happy ending. He leaves the worldly plane and goes to the... I think one thing we could say in general, also if you look at Sold into Marriage, as Wagner takes these themes, which are common themes in just general storybook and opera plots, and at first takes them kind of at face value. Themes like women being forced into marriage, or being bribed into marriage, as the case of Liebesverbot, or the case of marriages between mortals and immortals, and sort of accepts them at face value at first, but then explores them in much more critical ways, as is in his later works. It becomes much less accepting of the status quo, or much more analytic, much more profound. There's nothing particularly new in that. Let's see if we've forgotten any. Defame, certainly. Flying Dutchman, certainly. Lohengrin, certainly. Tannhäuser, certainly. The Ring, certainly. No, they're different societies, but they're very much in the same world. That one I don't.
Jeffrey, do you think the fact that except for maybe Walter and Eva, that these didn't end well, Wagner's making a comment on sort of marriage of unequals?
Well, I don't think he's making a comment about marriage necessarily. I personally think he's maybe making a comment about the concept that love is so often a question of trying to have what we don't, and that love is a projection of this romantic ideal of being cut off from a world that we long for, but which is not part of our own, and that it's by its nature impossible, or practically impossible. And it's even in the case of Wagner, which is a different kind of world. Nevertheless, we don't actually see a happy conclusion to the marriage of Eva and Walter. I mean, we just see them. We see them. It all looks rosy when the curtain goes down, but they're not married yet. So we don't even know they're there, I suppose. I mean, that's being. I think it has more to do with the nature of Wagner's ideas about the nature of love than it does, perhaps, with making a social commentary about the people marrying within their station. Okay, number 4 goes right into that. Conflicts between love and traditional morality. Zygmunt and Sieglinde, of course, that's the most right. Yes, Tristan and Isolde. And that, of course, Tristan and Isolde is really about that, because love sort of is an image from everything which is not the world of duty, the world of day, the world of morality, the world of obligation, the world of social connections, the world of reason. And love as a metaphor, let's say, for everything in the human psyche, which is about everything else, as it were. And they're very much, they don't exist well together at all. But, so what about,
Venus and Venus.
Right, that's a good example. I mean, because Venus and Elizabeth are a direct contradiction. And there, of course, if you remember, there's, I think, a wonderful, ironic, one of Wagner's absolute dramatic coup de génie in that particular work. Anybody that has to do with the resolution or an integration of this idea of the forbidden and the sacred and profane love, I'm going to call it. Yeah, but within Tannhäuser. Anybody think within Tannhäuser?
Well, because you told us.
Okay, that's fine. You remember.
The Evening Star.
That's right. That when Wolfram, who is the perfect picture of the chivalrous knight, sings his farewell, because he knows she's going to die, to Saint Elizabeth. She's not quite a saint yet, but she's well on her way to becoming one. What does he sing? He sings Ode to Abendstern, which is, what is the Abendstern? The Abendstern is Venus. He sings an ode to Venus as an ode to Saint Elizabeth. So he doesn't know it himself, perhaps, but he is. I think Wagner is making very ironic, quite beautifully ironic integration of the two kinds of love: the sacred love for Elizabeth and the profane love for Venus. What about in the early operas? Love and traditional morality. I think we've got it. Liebesverbot, certainly. I mean, there he goes beyond traditional morality. Of course, he really pretty stern. Although, I mean, he doesn't forbid sex. He just forbids sex out of marriage. He forbids fornication. But he forbids having a good time in general.
Frigga is traditional morality, Jeffrey.
Oh, okay.
I think Frigga is traditional morality, and that plays off all of Wotan's relationships with everybody else.
Yeah, that, I think Frigga would be perhaps maybe the best example of that conflict. The great scene in Valkyrie between Frigga and Wotan is basically a confrontation on the nature of morality, certainly. Yeah.
Siegfried and Brunhilde. He is...
At first, yes. Yeah, but Guillermo, is her resistance because of conventional morality, or because she's not used to the idea of being immortal yet? And I mean, but yeah, it can be played. It was played. By the way, you know, in 19th century productions and 19th century conceptions, if you read what people talk about of the end of Siegfried, I think that there was a good deal of regret. I personally feel that. Well, I don't want to get into that yet, but my own feelings about what Wagner had felt about that scene. But I feel like that there was a good deal of regret that Brunhilde has to kind of give in. And that I think there's a lot of sort of sympathy with the Brunhilde "don't touch me" figure, you know, like the pure, you know, radiant, you know, up on a pedestal figure. I don't think Wagner feels that, but I think that his contemporaries did very much. But that's certainly a scene that's up. Anybody else? What about the early operas? Silence. Free. What?
Espoused in Liebesberg, Friedrich espoused a kind of a traditional morality, which...
Yeah, right. I mean, right. He's a conflict himself, isn't he? I mean, I think the conflict is mostly with his own personality. The only person of any interest, really, in Liebesberg is the character of Friedrich. And he's definitely in conflict there. At the moment when she comes and begs for his brother's life, and he says, "Am I a man?" is perhaps the only really interesting moment dramatically in the work. And you know, when he's coming to wrestle with that. But I actually do think that the problems of morality, I mean, love and morality is not really a big issue, for instance, in Ramsey. It's not that's not particularly an issue in Grand Opera. Right? Grand Opera usually has issues having to do with the broader spectrum, political allegiances and you know, things of that sort, not so much personal relationships. Grand Opera doesn't have really room for personal relationships or feelings or things. I mean, it's not about that. It's all, you know, all very, very, very big.
Eric complained that you were the wrong way.
That's right. I think that that's the one I was thinking about the question. It's really Eric. Eric is a very sympathetic and conventional lover. And one can easily read this just from the outside and think, my God, poor guy, he's really getting shafted. Now, one thing that I wonder, that scene on the cliff when Father's coming home and they embrace, now in English it said they embraced. In German it said he squeezed her hand. I don't know if anybody else caught that. There's big differences in the translation. Now, there is a difference in embracing and squeezing someone's hand. Even in the 1840s, there was a difference in embracing and squeezing someone's hand. But nevertheless, did that really happen? Or she never responds. So, I mean, she never, she just says, I never made a vow to you. And he says, you squeezed my hand and looked me in the eyes. And that was a vow. So in his mind, anyway, you're right, she's been untrue to him. In his mind, in a way, since it has been untrue. And so a rejection of that, the Dutchman, who overhears the conversation's response, rather drastic response, is perhaps not entirely unjustified. So, an interesting idea.
Jeffrey,
yes?
What about internal conflict between sex and morality impossible with Klingsor?
Well, that of course, yes.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Well, and not just Klingsor, the Knights as a whole. You know, the whole relationship of the Knights of the Holy Grail with sex and chastity is really kind of a major issue, and one that is not really clear in the text. You know, those of us who would like to say that we all, I mean, we remember the famous Wieland Wagner Parsifal Cross, which had a lot of vogue for a certain amount of time, where he contrasts the flower maidens who are unchaste but innocent, because they're unchaste but they have no sort of sense of ramifications of what they're doing. And the Knights of the Grail, who are chaste but guilty, that have forced themselves to take vows of chastity, but because of that are susceptible to the wiles of the flower maidens. There's certainly some truth in that. And it's always seemed to me that Wagner views the chastity of the Knights of the Grail. I mean, with some, chastity is a very complicated issue in Parsifal. After all, there's that very famous moment when Kundry says to Klingzor, "Are you chaste?" and laughs at him. That brings out his big, Forsparo note moment. Because, of course, he's chaste only because, in his desire to be chaste, he castrates himself. And, of course, we know from afterwards, or at least Wagner's earlier conception, that Parsifal doesn't remain chaste because he gets married and has a child whose name is Lohengrin. But that's not necessarily a good argument, because the story of, Parsifal was originally thought of when Wagner was writing Lohengrin, but by the time he writes Parsifal down, it's 30 years later, and maybe his ideas have changed. I have never thought of Parsifal as being a work that extols chastity and celibacy, but it has been seen that way. Yeah.
Depends on how you define chastity. I think within Parsifal, and our whole reckoning, chastity actually includes sexuality within marriage.
Yeah.
It's fidelity in marriage.
Yeah, I think actually, and that's Michael Tanner's point in the essay we were talking about with the part of Parsifal, which he actually loves much more than I do. But his point is that people, and this is very true, the scene between Klingzor and Kundry, not Klingzor and Kundry, between Parsifal and Kundry in Act 2, when she tries to seduce him and he rejects her, it's not him espousing celibacy against her will. She's using sex as a forceful pawn. The sex that she's offering him is by no means a positive view of sex. And so what Parsifal is rejecting is not necessarily sex per se, but sex as a use for destruction, for damnation, for perdition in the world of Parsifal. So I think that's clear. I mean, I've always viewed, to me, we talked about this, I'm sure, at Parsifal, but to me, I always thought of Parsifal that when the curtain rises in Act 1, the conventional world, if we want to call it that, of the Knights of the Grail is rotten. Things have gone right off the bat. It's really terribly wrong with the Knights of the Grail. And the proof of it is that they're deserting, that they're so susceptible to Klingzor's wiles, and that they show no compassion to Kundry, and then no compassion to Fortis, and then no compassion later on to Parsifal either, when he arrives on the scene. They seem to be a very compassionate group. And since Parsifal is largely a work that prizes compassion as sort of the highest human emotion, human action, human feature, I don't think that we see it. So in that standpoint, looking at it as traditional, I think that both worlds in Parsifal, both Klingzor's world of seduction and the celibate world of the Knights of the Grail, are not portrayed as good worlds, to my view of Parsifal. Anybody want to argue that? Nobody wants to argue. Okay. Redemption, whatever that means. Big word in Wagner. Where do we have redemption in Wagner? I think we can all answer that. Tristan and Isolde. Hilda at the end, right? Certainly, Flying Dutchman. But that's not the first one. There's one before Zenta and the Flying Dutchman. I mean, supposedly, rather explicitly, supposedly the Rienzi. That's the whole point in Rienzi, in a way, is that yes,
he just tells us.
Yeah, he just tells us.
There's no external.
No, there's no external. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, it's completely empty. Yet the idea is supposedly that yes, he's going up in flames, but his idea, this is what Hitler, of course, picked up on something, that his ideal will live on. Hitler saw himself as a successful Rienzi. I mean, that's sort of the whole idea. You should have heard Friedland Wagner on that subject. Friedland Wagner basically had two salient memories of Uncle Wolf. I don't usually have to talk on this subject, but just because I became pretty good friends with her. One was that he had dreadful flatulence, and and terrible table manners. And the other was that he was absolutely obsessed with Koreans. And there was never a conversation with her mother that didn't include him bugging her to put on Rienzi at Byron. So, and his idea, sir, but I do think that maybe after the fact there's this idea of a kind of redemption. Well, actually, what about Defang? Certainly there's a kind of redemption. Defang, I mean, he's going to be destroyed, this world's going to be destroyed, and in the end, he goes up and lives in this fairyland forever with Ada. So I think that's a kind of redemption too. What about, of course, St. Elizabeth and Tannhäuser? Tannhäuser is certainly explicitly redeemed. Yes, he's healed, so sure. Actually, Parsifal would be the only one, except maybe Tannhäuser, where there's any kind of actual outward evidence of redemption, it seems to me. I mean, in Parsifal, you know, after all, the spear is brought back, the grail is redone, Amfortas is healed, Kundry is released from her curse. So actually we have...
Jeffrey, actually you do have the most puzzling line in Wagner right at the end of Parsifal, which is redemption to redeem.
That's the last words he wrote.
That's the last words he wrote, and it's very, very difficult to understand precisely what
he means. And Tanner talks about that a great deal. That is right, exactly. But yeah, but certainly, and maybe you do have a little bit of physical evidence of redemption, I suppose, in Tannhäuser. I mean, after all, the Pope's staff does burst into bloom, and I mean, Tannhäuser, he just dies, but nevertheless, it seems like that somehow he has been redeemed. There seems some kind of physical evidence. What about a Wagnerian work that contains no element of redemption? I can think of only one, because we haven't talked about one work. I think there is an element of redemption. One Wagnerian work is no. I disagree. I don't think so. I think Mexico does have an element of redemption. For Hans Sachs himself, perhaps. What? No, that's true. I forgot about the early ones. But what about Lohengrin has no redemption at all. Lohengrin, as you say, is the most tragic opera. Lohengrin is a total flop. Yeah, Lohengrin goes to redeem her and fails, so that's that. I mean, it's just a failure. I mean, you could say that Godfrey comes back. Okay, that's kind of a meager redemption. None of us believes in that. Nobody has ever believed in that. That's never been. To me, I don't know. We have different takes on Meistersinger, but to me, Meistersinger does have, in a way, that Hans Sachs, who is at this real crucial moment in his life, seems to have found some kind of acceptance of the fact that, as the mentor, as the artist, he finds some kind of personal. It's a much more mundane kind of redemption, but not some big flowery thing. I know we don't agree on that.
You have to decide what redemption is.
Yeah, that's true. What does Wagner ever really make it entirely clear what redemption is? I mean,
it's a very vague concept.
It's a very vague concept. But what it does seem to do, it's a vague concept except for this. It is the opposite, let's say, of Furchtbare, the concept of the dreadful predicament, which we're coming to. So let's leave it for that. The dreadful predicament, which is the quintessential Wagnerian condition, I would say, the redemption would be the resolution of that. Okay, let's go on. What about banned or forbidden questions? Lohengrin has the most famous novel. What about some more? We have
just yesterday.
That's almost exactly like Lohengrin. The only difference is that he asks the question, and of course she disappears and everything. But in Defang, nevertheless, there's a happy ending afterwards. Whereas in Lohengrin, there isn't. What about other banned or forbidden questions in Wagner's works? Yeah.
Lohengrin.
Well, Lohengrin has the banned. Lohengrin we've covered, right? Tannhäuser
can't talk about the Venus.
Well, it's not a banned question, but it's a banned. He certainly cannot mention the Venusberg. And what about Flying Dutchman? What does the Dutchman never say? Now she knows, but certainly never says openly. No one ever says openly. He doesn't say who he is. He says who he is at the very end. It's supposed to be this big, denouement, dramatic thing. You know ye that I am the Flying Dutchman, damned by Satan. He certainly doesn't come on stage and say to Dolly, I got all this money because I'm the Flying Dutchman. And I've been damned by Satan, so I got all this money, so I can marry your daughter. He doesn't. So it certainly is a kind of forbidden question. Certainly. She recognizes him in a way. But nevertheless, that's certainly not. He's supposed to be just some sailor who's been running the world, making lots of money, and has no home to go to. Any others? By this I meant basically things that people mustn't say.
We could take Albert's renunciation of love.
Yeah, it's a little bit different idea. So it's a little personal love. It's a little bit different idea. Yeah.
I think people are.
Anybody else?
In Rhine law, the Rhine maidens are giving away the.
They're not supposed to say.
They're not
That's
supposed
true.
to say.
They're not supposed to. Close syllable warns them that they're not supposed to talk about right. That's more of a plot conceit than a. Yeah, but still, I'd buy that.
It starts the whole thing off.
So anybody? Yeah.
Siegfried isn't supposed to know he's the son of Wotan, or else the obtaining of the ring will be innocent.
Yeah, Siegfried's not supposed to know a lot of things. Siegfried's not supposed to know he's the son of Wotan. But look, I always thought about, actually I wrote the question, the one I thought about in the ring was when Siegfried forces Mima to tell him the mystery of his birth, which Mima has avoided telling him for obvious reasons. When Mima does tell him, Mima tells him finally the name of the sword and the name of his mother. He will not tell him the name of his father, which is kind of interesting. He knows it. He spouts right off to Wotan and about 15 minutes later. But, Siegfried says, I don't know his name. All your mother said was that he died fighting in battle. So, that's kind of forbidden. The concept of these questions, too, what about in the next scene? The scene in Siegfried, the Wagner scene. It's not so much a forbidden question, but an unanswered question. I think this is one of the more underestimated and understood scenes in the ring.
You mean when Wotan comes in?
Yeah, Wotan, the Wotan or Wagner Mima scene. It's all about questions, actually.
Well, Mima obviously doesn't ask the question.
Exactly.
No.
Mima, the guy's going on stage. Before he comes on stage, Mima's tearing his hair out, asking himself a question, basically. How can I forge this sword? Or who's going to forge, how can I forge the sword? Here's a guy who comes on stage, says, I know everything, and I stake my head, I can answer any question you can ask. And he doesn't ask that question. So that's sort of, it's not so much the forbidden question, but the question not asked.
Parsifal also had a question when he moved to us.
He doesn't answer any questions at the beginning. He's asked all sorts of questions. It's really kind of, can you really do that? They ask him what your name is. The only thing he knows is who his mother was, which is in itself kind of interesting.
He didn't ask who his father.
He doesn't know who his father is. He actually probably doesn't know who his father is. But they ask where is he from. He says, I don't know. Who are you? What's your country? I don't know. What's your name? I don't know. I had many, but I've forgotten all of them. And then finally they said, I had a mother. Her name was Herzelina, and he does remember.
Surely the big question he doesn't ask is what's wrong with that performance?
Yes, that was the other thing. That was a huge question. And that's always sort of another very interesting part in Parsifal that doesn't come out very well in the productions that I've seen. Is to my mind, the whole last part of Act 1 of Parsifal always falls flat, especially the last business with the voices and stuff. Because Gordemans, obviously, I think Wagner expects too much of us there, perhaps, because Gordemans recognizes Parsifal. That's, I think, crucial to the whole plot. He recognizes that he's the pure fool that's going to save him. And he expects Parsifal to respond to the Grail scene and to Amfortas' sufferings. And he actually does, but Gordemans doesn't see it. Or he's not able to do it verbally. I guess that's all that matters. So, but it's very, and then Gordemans in his frustration says, run away, you silly goose. Go find yourself you gander, or find yourself a goose or some such line. Is the gander? Is that the anyway, it's never entirely clear. But you're right. That's a question he's supposed to ask. Why is he suffering so much? And what can be done to alleviate his suffering? What about tests and trials to prove worthiness? There's lots of those around.
Pulling the sword from the tree.
Siegmund pulling the sword from the tree. Absolutely. Walter singing a song that's worthy of winning. He sings 2 songs, actually sings 3 songs. And only the last one is worthy of what's the test? Not great. What's the test?
Let's go resist the resist country.
Resist country, and there's another test he has. Very important test. again, he did his own trade music. Right? He's got to find his way back. That's a major part of the story of Parsifal, which of course is only portrayed in the music, right?
Siegfried reaching the magic fire.
Exactly. Siegfried reaching the magic fire.
And excuse me? Actually, it's Elsa who tested.
Yes. He tests Elsa. That's right. Exactly. Precisely.
How do you go to Rome?
Yes. Yes. That's actually a good answer. Tannhäuser are going to Rome. Right. Right. The idea is that he's going to be okay if he does that. He comes back forgiven. Right. It backfires. Yeah, exactly. But that's right. It's a quid pro quo of a certain sort. Yeah.
How about all the contestants at the work group? They're all being tested.
And the Meistersinger too. Sure. It's the whole concept of being sort of tested to show your worthiness. Yeah.
Siegfried forging the sword and slaying the dragon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can almost say that slaying the dragon is a foregone conclusion, since sort of the sword has been made for him to do that. But forging the sword is a true test. Absolutely. But sure, both of them are tests. What about in the early operas? Flying Dutchman, I don't think has a test. Dufay very clearly, that Dufay has an explicit, the very first opera, very, very explicit test that he's supposed to do. Part of the test is to not ask him. Yeah. Yeah, but there's other things that he's supposed to do. In Rienzi, anybody tested in Rienzi really?
No, really.
Not really. And Leaves Rule, I don't know well enough to know. I sort of spent too much on the Shakespeare, and that's not fair. No, I mean, nobody falls. There's a test.
You can say Friedrich is tested.
Friedrich is tested. Yeah, anybody's tested that, right, Isabella? I think we can say about the testing that it becomes more important. Part of it is just because, of course, there's a common theme in mythological subjects. As Wagner takes mythological subjects. Yeah?
So you would say that Santa was tested in her love.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you at the end.
Santa's love?
Yes, Santa's very definitely tested. That's good. In a way, the whole idea is a test. Is she going to be faithful? Right. And the fact that she can't join him on the boat, she'll throw herself in the sea. Sure, that's a kind of test. That she faithful unto death. Well, that's a pretty straightforward answer. So that's a good answer, yeah.
But the kiss to Brunhilde.
The kiss to Brunhilde. Yeah, I mean, he has to know to do it, to wake her up. You could say that. That's right. He has to have the maturity. It's funny, actually. That's a very interesting point, because it's one that we never think about. We take it for granted because we all grew up in myths. But, you know, he comes up there and finds somebody in armor, and then is very much surprised and very much chagrined to realize that it's a woman, which he's never seen a woman before, so he sort of only must instinctively know it's a woman. And then he doesn't know what to do about it for a while, and he decides the right thing to do is to kiss him. Which is kind of a test, actually. I mean, what if he decided to kick it? He finds a good way to respond, yes. Anybody else? Tests? Lots of those. Okay, let's move down to the two I added, because the last three have to do with music. Okay, what I call note, characters who are in predicaments of their own making. Yeah, Wotan is, of course, sort of quintessential. He's so complicated, right? And he's in many different predicaments of his own making. He's sort of he extricates himself from one predicament to put himself into a new one. As the curtain rises, the first predicament he's in that we see is the predicament of having paid for Valhalla with Freya, which he can't give away. And then, of course, once he does actually get the right gold, get the giants to agree to take the right gold as payment, and then he gets the ring, and gives up the ring, then he's in the predicament that he realizes that as long as the ring is in existence, that eventually Alberic's going to get it back, and then he's going to be destroyed in the worst possible way. So he has a new predicament. He can't touch Fafnir, but somebody else has to. And then how can you create a race of heroes that will do what you want them to do without you having anything to do with getting them to do it? So he's caught up. And actually, then we find out later that Wotan has even a deeper and more basic predicament, which is that the very creation of his spear and its sacred runes with which he rules the world caused the world Astrid to start to die in the way earlier off beginnings of the whole story. We learned this from the Norns. And of course, in the original ring, this is practically the first thing we learn. So we only hear about it in Good but it's happened way back in the. I guess if one were to make a chronology of ring events, that are important to the ring, that would be practically the first, yeah?
Almost any character in Wagner, because Wagner saw tragedy as being basically getting out of predicaments that you put yourself in. So Dutchman is clearly.
Dutchman is clearly. Tannhäuser is clearly. Wolfram is clearly.
Yes.
Wolfram, the conflict between friendship, love, chivalry, all sorts of things. Absolutely. Venus, not Venus, of course. Elizabeth herself. Absolutely. She finds a novel way of getting out of it. She becomes a saint. Tristan, Isolde. They both are tremendously. Absolutely. Even to some extent, perhaps for a gaining criminal. Certainly, Tristan and Isolde. Totally. Frigga herself. She wants Wotan back. I mean, I think, absolutely. Mima is a terrific example. He needs to bring up Siegfried and needs to have him do these things, but if he makes Siegfried too strong, how is he going to get the ring from him? So he's very much along. Albrecht is in the first scene. I don't think he is afterwards. In the very first scene he is, because he's ugly and hateful, and he wants one of these pretty bridesmaids. I mean, so he's got a... But that one is less, that one doesn't really fit, because it's not... The only way it's based on an inner thing is that he doesn't have a sense of who he is. He doesn't have a sense of sort of appropriateness. And Fortis is perhaps Wagner's favorite example of it, because, you know, he wants to be holy and to do his duties at the Grail, but every time he does, his wound reopens and has this terrible moral anguish. Kundry herself is certainly torn between her desire for redemption and the own curse on herself that causes her to laugh. Yes, but he got himself into the mess because he's trying to heal it's his own doing. Because he's trying to heal the problems of himself. I mean, he's aware of the problems, and he's going to try to use the spear in an inappropriate way. Very often, people get themselves into these messes by doing something in inappropriate ways. Anybody think of Wagner, and the early ones too have, certainly this is something we do have in the early, I mean, the figure of Friedrich and Liebesvermögen is pretty clear cut. But even in some very rudimentary way, Arundel and Ada both have this situation to some extent because they dare to love in realms outside of their own, so they have problems caused by that. What about Rienzi?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. Even Rienzi.
I mean, he tells everybody that he's a man of will.
Yeah.
He's a leader to freedom.
And then he makes deals. And he makes deals with, that's right, the shadiest dealings possible. And Irene, who was in love with the enemy and yet extremely loyal to her brother and torn with that. I think that the only Wagner opera that doesn't have a lot of this typical predicament is Lohengrin. And Lohengrin, one character does, very much so, which I think is Telramund. Because Telramund is very much impacted, very much craves and needs her approval and support. I think he probably really loves her. She has some kind of hold over him. At the same time, he very much wants to be, he cares very much about social standing and political and social success. Gunther is a great example of that. Gunther, I think, is a very good example of this kind of predicament.
What about Tommy Socks?
Socks is a fantastic example. Sure. I mean, he's totally torn. I mean, he's in love with Ava, but knows it's not appropriate. He ends up helping his rival. He ends up guaranteeing his failure. You should make a big thing about it. Very shoulder-powering.
Can we revisit Isolde? I don't see how she's her plight isn't prone making, and in fact, most of these that you've named are men. Very few of the significant ones anyway are women.
Okay, well, let's look at Isolde. That's fine. Let's look at Isolde, let's look at Kundry, let's look at a few other ones. Well, Isolde is just that. Isolde is less than, she's not torn in the same way. Isolde is in Act 1. Very much so. The Isolde of Acts 2 and Act 3 is not. In Acts 2 and Act 3, Isolde is not conflicted, she's just separated from Tristan. Until she recognizes Tristan's great conflict, which is much more cosmic than just the problems of being unfaithful to his stepfather and liege lord and friend and guardian. But Isolde in Act 1 is tremendously conflicted. It's a perfect example of Wagner.
She didn't make the mess.
No, well, no, yes she did. No, but you don't have to make the mess. You have to be complicit in the mess, Lynn. Isolde, why is Isolde upset in Act 1? Why when the curtain rises is she such a dreadful mess?
She's mad at herself.
Yes, that's the whole thing. She's mad at herself. If you're mad at yourself, that's already Wagner. That's a perfect example of Wagnerian art. She's mad at herself because what she feels like she should be is just raining out curses on all these bastards. killing Tristan, going back home and declaring war against Cornwall. That's what she thinks she should be doing, because the horrible affront they did to Morold, and the affront to her country, and to the affront to her own sense of dignity. Why doesn't she do any of this? Because she's so weak, she's fallen in love with the guy. The whole action of Tristan and Isolde is predicated on that. Her weakness, and that she's fallen in love with him. And so I think that's a perfect example of the... Now, Sieglinde has it in a different way. In her case, it's true. I don't think that she's for making it all. She feels so horribly guilty about the fact that she's, been forced into marriage to Hunding. So I would agree that in her case, there's really no, and it's not really the same thing. And Guttrun, it's not, and even in Fricka, it's more limited. But
what
but
about
certainly, Gudrun, first thing, it is her own doing in a way. I mean, she laughs at Christ on the cross, which is a symbol for something. But she certainly is tremendously conflicted. She's certainly conflicted. I mean, she's just,
Brunhilde, I mean, she disobeys her father, and so she makes her own predicament.
She absolutely, and she has several different predicaments as the reign goes on. Her earliest predicament is in Act 2 of Valkyria, when she wants to be faithful. She's been taught to love the Belgians, and more than loving the Belgians, also to love what they stand for, which is Wotan's great idea. The idea of heroism, the idea of breaking out the rut of this traditional sort of buying and selling of power, this way. It's something higher and freer and more noble, and yet she's her father's will, and her out is that I was obedient to your real will, and so. But she's extremely conflicted. And then later in Gudrun, I mean, I don't know how conflicted she is, but she certainly loves Siegfried all along, and she is the party that makes his undoing possible. Without her participation, one of the key things of Hagen's plot is that he uses the two strongest people. The only person who's strong enough to really get at Siegfried is Brunhilde, and so he uses her to kill him. And the only person really strong enough to undo Brunhilde is Siegfried, so he uses Siegfried. Siegfried, wearing the Tarnhelm, goes through the fire, and Brunhilde gives the information necessary to kill Siegfried. So, but she's conflicted, certainly, both. It's not as clear-cut as someone like Gunther, or certainly someone like Wotan, or Forrest, but I think it's pretty clear-cut. Anybody else? We're almost done with this, so. Okay, what about fire? The role of fire. There's a very clear-cut. Sort of purifying or destroying fire. The ring, Siegfried being protected by Siegfried's fire, Brunhilde's fire. Siegfried goes to the fire, Brunhilde's stone. Any other fires?
Immolation of Siegfried.
The immolation of Siegfried, the immolation scene, purifying fire at the end of the ring.
The porridge.
Yeah. Loga himself. The image of who Loga is kind of interesting. I always like productions where Loga is from the very start somehow identified very strongly with fire. Sort of this kind of, there's a lot of different, we'll do that when we get to the ring. There's so many, Loga is such a figure that's interpreted in many different ways. I mean, just to give a little force fighting, as it were. Think about the fact that George Bernard Shaw says that Loga is the epitome of hypocrisy. And I just forgot his name. I saw him roll in. Cook says that Loga is the one character in the ring who always tells the absolute truth. That's right. Fire is significant there too. Very good. Yes, and very, very important significance in Tristan, the torch. The one that Tristan is getting ready to die says, do I hear the torch? Which is kind of an interesting one. Okay, let's go to numbers 8, 9, and 10. What about using chorus and ensemble as finales of acts? Now, of course, one of the things about Rienzi that we didn't talk about is the extraordinary lack in a 6-hour opera of solo music. There's Rienzi's prayer, and Adriano has a big cabaletta and aria, which is also sort of starts off with a prayer too. But there's practically no other solo music in the piece. I mean, more than 50% of Rienzi is choral. That's just the nature of Grand Opera. Well, not so much choral, it's also processions and ensembles, in other words, with chorus and characters. So it's very, very common, it's most common in Rienzi. So What about later operas, where we have examples of chorus, with chorus also with ensembles joining in? Meistersinger, all 3 acts, correct? All 3 acts. Yes. Act 1, Act 2, and not almost Act 3. Actually, the chorus does sing with right before or last before. So all 3 acts as well, right?
The first act of Dutchman? That end with the sailor?
Yeah, a little bit, right, a little bit. Dutchman, the chorus doesn't function at the end, that doesn't, all 3 acts a tiny bit. It doesn't have this big, I was thinking more though of these kind of scenes where we have the chorus and soloists kind of going back and forth doing a big,
Parsifal.
A big deal.
The end of Parsifal?
Parsifal, though, it's almost entirely chorus, but there is a little tiny bit at the end there with what Tidorel says as words and Gurdemont's throws Parsifal out. That's kind of after. That's a great example. The final scene, they're never sure. That's a really good. Even though the chorus doesn't sing. Second act, they're never. The chorus doesn't sing as it happens right there. They only sung earlier. The chorus sing. So we have the Vengeance Trio, and then the chorus comes on. They don't sing. There's some stage music, but the chorus doesn't sing. But it's certainly in that tradition.
In Ramsey, you said that the women are describing the effects of the battle that's going on off stage. I mean, he's using the chorus.
Well, in Rienzi, all 5 acts is the chorus. Every one, 5 out of 5. That's very much the tradition. I guess the background of this question is that the tradition of grand opera was an acts end with choral finales, usually with going back and forth with the chorus and soloists. What about Tristan?
The Pilgrim's chorus at the end of Tannhäuser, they come by as...
Yeah, and they come right out of the soloist too. That's
green branches.
Yeah. But even Act 2 of Tannhäuser is a choral finale exactly like we have in Verdi. There is a convention, the next to the last act of Italian operas always end with big choral finales. Verdi just always does it. Except for Falstaff, I think every opera there does it. Well, no, the Rhines, but he puts it to a different act, second act of Aida. It's usually a big rousing thing when the soprano goes up to a high note, the big climb. But Tannhäuser is a perfect example. So is Lohengrin. Both Lohengrin and Tannhäuser have. Lohengrin is different with the wedding scene, the going into the Münster. Those are both very much right out of the tradition. And I think that's an element of Verdi which is close to grand opera, actually. The big, think of the big, the Otello, I think, but also Simone, La Maschera, but even going back to the earlier ones, Rigoletto, that's very much sort of a big feature. Even the end of the first act of Tristan kind of a little bit. Kind of a strange opera to think of that, but the chorus does come when they arrive on shore, and there's a sort of explosion of chorus, makes a big impression, sort of the outer world coming in on the people. Okay, let's go on. What about musical motifs representing an important element of the drama, which later on in the Ring we usually call leitmotifs? What about from the early operas? Okay, Lohengrin we have with the forbidden question. That's a classic early example. Why? Here's an interesting question for you though. In what way is that not like a Ring leitmotif, or the great majority of the Ring leitmotifs?
The Ring one, identified person.
No, ring leitmotifs also, for instance, there are ring leitmotifs that identify events or ideas too. But there's something about ring leitmotifs in general which is different from this leitmotif.
They change.
They change. This one never changes. This one is just a label. And so the kind of motif that these also be conferring and Lohengrin, everybody knows, this one. Question. Other composers, Weber has already done that, and Verdi has already done that. There's nothing new particularly about doing that. What's new in the Ring of this use is that there are constant change, and there's another really big, in the Ring, the idea in the Ring is that all the music is modes. It's not that something comes in and sticks in and says, oh, we're referring to this. Wagner's concept of the Ring is that 100% of the music is all the music, all the time is motivic. So you're never not hearing motivic material. Things come out in very major ways and sort of strike through the face, but something all the time is motivic. There's a very interesting, I was asked once, I made this comment to what's the name of the Ring and I? Which New York radio station did that?
Oh, that was NYC.
NYC did a several-hour program on the ring when the Met lasted in Florida 2 times ago, and I did a part on that. They actually even did a CD on it. And the part, they had a guy go over to my apartment and he asked me some questions. And one time he said, I would take a page at random from the ring and totally analyze it motivically. Totally. So I opened up the score and played the page from Good Hammer, and I spent, half an hour, because everything is. If you really want to get down to a reductive, I mean, there's no reason to do that necessarily, but you can do that. So that's fair. Whereas, so it's very different. But Lohengrin is still a good answer. What about earlier than Lohengrin? What about the operas we've listened to? What about the 4 operas we had just now? You know what I think? Yeah?
Well, you mentioned the trumpet call, or the one-note trumpet call in Rienzi.
That's not a motive. That's not a motive. That's not a motive in that sense. I mean,
Forbidden Love?
Yeah, let's get that one. That's different. I mean, yes, it's just as part of the stage action. Yes, you can say it is. I don't want to be so short. I hadn't thought of it in that light. But also, it's just the one note. But the one note isn't an issue. You have to be careful. The idea that using music from the overture and the piece, or vice versa in this case, it doesn't constitute this.
Well, I raised it because you had asserted that it's symbolic of Rienzi's aspirations.
No, I didn't. Simon asserted. Simon asserted. But that's fine. Okay, I'll buy it.
Simon would have given you credit for the answer.
I'll buy it. That's okay. I don't think that Rienzi. I think that really of the first of the 3 Prentice operas, the one that really features the idea of this a little bit, that really foreshadows his use in later works, is Liebesverbot. The way in which Liebesverbot is most significant. Wagner does use the theme of that the theme of Friedrich, which kind of comes in very awkwardly right at the beginning of the prelude, of the forbidden love, all through the opera. It undergoes lots of changes, it comes in lots of different ways. It very much foreshadows Wagner's use of leitmotifs later. And it's by far, it's the most significant thing about Liebesverbot. The reason to study Liebesverbot, in a way, would be a very good justification, because it does foreshadow, and no one else has done that as far as I know at that point. So that is something. In Flying Dutchman, we have elements. I mean, because the 3-note descending thing comes from Sintes Ballade, but it would be kind of silly to think that when we have the sailor's dance, that there's some relationship with that other than a musical one to Sintes Ballade and her dream of redemption, her dream of redeeming this poor Flying Dutchman. So it's different in a way. It's more a strictly musical motif, I would say, than one that's really dramatic. I don't think it represents something. All the sea music does, but that's really descriptive. In Tannhäuser, there's music that represents sort of elements of that. We certainly recognize in time that Venusberg is mentioned. There's music that obviously we associate with Venusberg and Pilgrim's Chorus and things like that. But really, it's the ring that it really comes from the ring on, then it becomes much more significant. I have to finish. I'm going to finish. And the last one, what about fanfares? This is sort of an interesting thing. I would put the A, the long A in the fanfare category. Wagner has a thing about fanfares. Yeah.
Act 2 of Tannhäuser.
No. What about Act 1 of Tannhäuser? And they're all the hunting horns. It goes on for about 15 minutes. But that's the longest single fanfares of music. More fanfares at Rienzi than anything else.
Absolutely glowing.
Oh God, you go on forever. Gigantic, go on forever. That huge crescendo. That can be effective though with the chorus coming in.
Tremendous.
Yeah, and then the Dawn, Act 2 of Lohengrin. All 3 acts of Lohengrin is an orgy of on-stage brass doing fanfares. I'd say in general, except for Flying Dutchman, all the early Wagner operas have tons of fanfares. So Rienzi just got millions of them. And then in the later works, they really kind of disappear. And when they do come back, he's really sort of transmuted them. I mean, you could say that this is a fanfare of a sort, but it's very much been transmuted. Yes, in Good Hammer, the wedding call, but that's also much more musical than this. Yeah.
Licensing Act 3,
oh yes.
Apprentices.
All that, and right, and then at the very end as well. That's right. And he would say one last time.
What about the shepherd signaling the arrival of the ship in action?
That is kind of a fanfare music. That's true. It's quite clever. Yes. And actually, in the Act 1, we have just for a little bit they're playing. They play real straightforward fanfares. They're playing, like. At the end of Act 1 of Tristan. Actually, it's very much in contrast. It's like this brash, everyday world sort of with floodlights coming in on the scene of the lovers. Yeah.
Would you get it in Act 2 in Tristan, and
right. That to me is the
specifically about the poems.
Right. Well, and that was my favorite actually. That was because I guess the point of my question had to do, I guess, as much as that something that Wagner in his early life, I think he just liked brass and fanfare music. And one of the things you'll notice, if we talk about instrumentation again, is just as Wagner uses less and less percussion as his works goes along, he uses less and less brass. He uses brass again more in Parsifal, but that has a lot to do with the acoustics of the house.
I wondered, would you consider the trombone and the prelude to Parsifal a fanfare?
Well, you mean just there's both the Dresden Amen and the, not a fanfare, but it's what's happened in Wagner. By and large, and the Tristan example is the best to me, the offstage horns, the hunting horns. He's transmuted them into something much more musically and psychologically complex. But the role of them changes. I mean, all through the Ring, there's some of the motifs in the Ring certainly have a fanfare. Even the Rite of the Valkyries is kind of a minor key fanfare. I mean, a whole lot of motives of a certain sort of type, I don't want to get into that yet, that's next year, but are sort of fanfare-like. But he's to a great extent either completely incorporated them into his musical style in a much more sophisticated and complex way, or he's, in the case like in the Tristan ones, he's turned them into a symbolic thing where they, I think one of the more inspired things in Tristan, of course I think those offstage anymore in Tristan are unbelievably inspired and evocative, but the way they melt in as old as the years into the sounds of the fountain and the rustling of the leaves and all the things that are suggestive of night as the realm of sensuality and magical seduction. So it's very far away from these sort of real marching band fanfares, which we get so much of in Tom Waits and Gandhi's law. Yeah.
Talking about fanfares, when I was a firewood and they opened every performance, the fanfares, how far back does that go? From the beginning, or is this something that is more recent?
You know what? I don't know. It wasn't done in Wagner's time, I don't think, but it's been done a long, long time. I've seen pictures of them doing it in the 1890s, certainly.
Is there anything that you see with the size of announcing it?
That's fun. I would say this, that the choice of music has changed. It's not the same music as when I was there the first time. Some things stay the same, but some things have changed. I'll finish with,
Well, question, if it's not optional, John, explain the Dresden Amen. Can you explain it to me? I know what it is, but I don't know why they call it the Dresden Amen.
Well, because it was the way they sang Amen in Protestant churches in Dresden. And the first composer that uses it a lot, prominently, is Mendelssohn, as far as I know, in the Fifth Symphony, and the Reformation Symphony. Yes?
I think that Dutchman's theme is a fanfare.
Kind of.
It has the
equals. Yeah, it does. It doesn't have, it doesn't have, it only fits, like the Ninth Symphony. And so it doesn't